I should briefly say just before we get into this review of Saw 2 that if you are new to this channel and you haven't seen any of the Saw films, I would recommend checking out my review for the first movie before you carry on with this one. If however you've already seen Saw 1 or seen that review, then of course proceed. Now, as I mentioned in the first part of my Saw review series for, of course, the first movie, this installation in the franchise, Saw 2, is probably my favourite. At least so far. Of course, I haven't seen the latest instalment, which is due to come out relatively soon, but so far I would say that this second film is probably the strongest overall for me personally. And the reason why I view this as my personal favourite all-round Saw movie is because although the first movie also doesn't rely on special effects as much as the rest, this one as well, I think, manages to also do that. It has a much more suspenseful story, which relies more on the crime thriller side of things, and also the development of characters rather than just waiting for the next trap, which is what some people view the later incarnations of the franchise as being. And although I can understand that, I wouldn't necessarily agree with it. I do enjoy all of the Saw films, definitely some more than others, but later on, you can certainly see why people would think it was more about the traps. That's not the case, but the traps do tend to garner a lot of attention, and that's why more attention is given to them. Not because they're essential to the plot, but because 9 times out of 10, that's what people go in expecting to see. With this second film, that wasn't the case yet. After the amazing financial, primarily, but also to some degree critical success of the first film, this film had a lot to live up to, and one of the reasons why it's my favourite of the entire franchise is because it manages to do very similar things to the first film in terms of having a good story, great characters, and good development, but it fills in the gaps that the first movie had, at least for me personally. Primarily speaking, to do with the quality of the production. The first movie, as we discussed in that review, only had a budget of between $1 and $1.2 million. This movie has a budget of $4 million, which is still tiny by movie standards, but that's considerably larger, roughly 4 times larger than the first film, and it really shows. The camera work, the audio, the amount of actors involved, and generally the calibre of acting involved is, I would say, better than the first film. But apart from the acting, I would say it is really the strength of the production quality that makes this one so much better than the first film in particular. Now, this movie doesn't rely on gore as much as some of the later movies. I don't dislike the gore, but the story for me is the most impressive thing about the Saw franchise and the way it works through the entire series, essentially like one really long movie, which just happens to have different people in directing and writing roles, but they all do a really great job of tying it all in, raising questions, answering previous ones, bringing in characters new and old, etc. And although some people find that a little too convoluted or unbelievable, personally I have no issue with it. I love the twists and turns that the series takes, even in the installments which I don't enjoy quite as much, such as, for instance, Saw 3. Now, this particular film, as I said, is my favourite of all of them, at least probably, with my second favourite being the fourth film. And interestingly, both this second movie and the fourth movie share one primary thing in common, and that is the involvement of Darren Lynn Bousman. Now, the first movie was, of course, written by Leigh Whannell. This movie is also written by him, but also partially by Darren Lynn Bousman and directed by Darren Lynn Bousman instead of James Wan. Now, the second, third, and fourth movie are directed by Bousman, and those are definitely my favourite 3 of the entire Saw franchise. And it's in this second movie that we're first introduced to a character of a police officer played by Donnie Wahlberg, and I think he's a good new addition. In the first movie, I think the police do a perfectly fine job. Danny Glover probably stands out the most, but even then, the police didn't feel like really deep characters. They felt more like people who are just there to do the typical police role. Whereas in this second film, without spoiling anything of course, the police have a more personally involved role, and not just the police officer played by Donnie Wahlberg, but others as well. And as you would expect, we see the return of Tobin Bell as Jigsaw in the primary role of the killer who sets up the traps, and in this movie you get to see more of him on a face-to-face level, as you can see from some of the screen grabs in this video. Now, as far as the story of this second film, it's similar in ways to the first one, and of course now we have lots of other movies to compare it to that came after it, but at the time we didn't. We only had that first movie, and although it has similarities to the first film, especially in tone compared to the others that would come after it, it does enough to up the ante. There are more people involved, more traps involved, more twists and turns, not just with the situation, but with characters themselves, that I really liked. And although I may be forgetting certain aspects here and there, as far as my memory serves me, I believe this second movie is probably the least gory of the entire Saw franchise. So anyone who says that Saw fans are purely in it for the gore is quite simply wrong, because this is the least gory as far as I'm concerned, and I enjoy it the most, because it really allows you to totally focus on, as I mentioned earlier, that story, those characters, and the development, not just of Jigsaw, but of everyone involved. One of the things that the Saw franchise, I would say, does very well, even in the movies that aren't as good, is that it does a pretty good job, and in some cases a great job, of making even technically unimportant characters have some weight to them. You actually do care about the majority of the people involved. Now, of course, some people more than others, some people are annoying, some people you'll flat out hate or maybe even want to die. But if you think about it, that means that even those characters who you may hate are doing their job. That's what they're there for. And to me, that makes them very good characters. They're not annoying or stupid characters. They're doing exactly what they're supposed to do in the script. And they do it, I think, very well, in particular in this second movie. Now, the first Saw film, although definitely tying into this one, isn't as necessary, I wouldn't say. It is, of course, necessary, and as I've mentioned before, you should watch them all, especially in order, but you can come into this second movie without necessarily loving the first one, and still really enjoy it. Me, for instance, I wasn't a huge fan of the first one. This one, I am a huge fan of, and I personally view the Bousman 3 movies as kind of their own trilogy. They have a nicely rounded story, which runs through all three, with various characters, and the stakes keep getting pushed. And personally, 2, 3, and 4, I would say, have the strongest story arc of all of the Saw films. And I'm sure some people would disagree with that, but that's at least my personal opinion. Now, as far as critical reception, monetary earnings, etc., we already touched on the fact that it had a $4 million budget to the first movie's roughly 1.2, and it also made more. The first movie made just over 100 million, this made just under 150 million, so far more, and again, massively profitable. And it's not difficult to see why they kept on making these movies, because even when they started to drop off, you're still making a huge profit. Now, as far as critical success, it's not amazingly good, but it's certainly positive in general. Most of the reviews that the movie gets tend to be either okay to good. Not necessarily amazing, but not many would call it bad either. It tends to be somewhere in that middle to high ground, and that's pretty good. Now, what about our individual ratings, and also how does it compare to the first one in terms of those ratings? Well, first of all, as always, we have the story and the plot, and I gave the first movie a 6 out of 10. This movie, on the other hand, I'm rating 2 points higher, with a pretty impressive 8 out of 10. And the reason why I'm giving it such a high rating is because the pacing for me is perfect. It's not too fast, it's definitely not too slow. There are plenty of characters, there's plenty of development for the most important characters, and it plays out well. There are people who you want to see better off. There are characters who you want to see do well. There are story arcs that you want to see unearthed and answered, and there are twists and turns that of course you don't expect, and they're great. they serve the purpose, and definitely when you consider the movies to come after, really do pave the way for bigger storytelling in the Saw franchise. What though about those characters and their motivations? Well, I kind of touched on that in the story and plot. They're very good, as far as I'm concerned. Some of the best characters of the whole series. Not necessarily the very best. And in terms of the rating system, I'm going to give it a 7, which is 1 point higher than the first movie. And the only reason why it doesn't rate even higher than that is because some of the characters aren't necessarily annoying, but they're characters who you don't care about as much. Although I did mention earlier that they do a good job of making you care to some degree about everyone, and that is true. But at the same time, there are some characters who could have even been removed from the plot. They weren't essential, but they certainly don't ruin the film, and as such, it wouldn't be fair to rate it quite as high as some of the others in the series, such as number 4, in that regard. But still, a 7 out of 10 is perfectly respectable. What though about the visuals and the special effects? Well, as I mentioned in the first review, the entire franchise has fantastic practical effects, fantastic makeup, some of the best makeup of modern films, I would say, and for this one I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. And the reason why it's not quite a full 10 is because, as I said, it is one of, if not the least goriest of all of the movies in the franchise. And although that's certainly not a bad thing, as such you just don't get as much of those special effects, or as many of them, showcased. Overall though, the look of the film is significantly better than the first one, and that in particular increases the score for me. As I mentioned in the first one, that was one of my biggest drawbacks of that first film. Not a surprising drawback, but a drawback nonetheless. This one completely solves that issue. The audio is better, the visuals are better, and the effects look more polished, more clean, but still gritty. It's not overly Hollywoodized. It was perfect, I would say, but not necessarily as often as in other films, so it wouldn't really be fair to those other movies in the series, which had even better effects, to rate this equally. So a 9 out of 10, I think, is about right for this movie. What though about the audio and the soundtrack? Well, I'm going to give it the same rating as, and this is kind of a spoiler, but not really, as all of the other movies in the series. I'm giving every Saw movie to come from here after a 6 out of 10. Because in general, the audio quality, the sound design, the soundtrack in particular, doesn't really change that much. And that's not a bad thing. It has that continuity. It feels and sounds like the same world, and you feel like it is one big connected universe. Whereas again, the lower quality of the first film kind of doesn't fit in with that. Of course it does from a storytelling point of view, but the quality isn't on par with them. So that movie I gave a 5, all of the rest I'm giving a 6. And finally, the most subjective to me personally of our 5 categories is of course the rewatchability and the entertainment factor. And for that, I'm going to give Saw 2 a 9, which is, alongside one other movie in the franchise, the highest rating that I'm going to give to any Saw movie. And I don't give many movies a 9 or even a 10 out of 10 for rewatchability and entertainment, but for me it definitely has that. The combination of all of the elements that made the first movie popular, combined with that increase in quality, better characters, and just a story that feels bigger, but not necessarily too big, is just enough to combine and give it that great score. So as a combination of our 5 categories put together, I'm giving Saw 2 a 3.9 out of 5, which is significantly higher than the first film, which I gave a 3, and also pretty high in general. That's a reasonably high score, certainly higher than most people give this film. But personally, I feel it's totally justified in getting that score, and is, as I said, probably my favourite of the entire series. So overall, that's it for this particular review, and if you haven't seen any of the Saw films, well, what are you still doing here? But I would definitely check them out. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.